So, as it says on your order of service, our topic today is the second principle of Unitarian Universalism, which is that we affirm justice, equity, and compassion in human relations. And I'm going to share with you a reading from a UU minister named Richard S. Gilbert. Here he describes how these three things go together, how it's actually compassion that motivates us to act for equity and for justice. And he has a really compelling story from history to back it up. He says, compassion is the spiritual value that undergirds Unitarian Universalist ethics. Living compassionately is an act of thanksgiving, flowing from the blessings of life we wish to share. The overflow of that compassion in the individual leads to the quest for equity and justice. Put by theologian Gene Reeves, it means to be is to be for others. Compassion comes from the Latin word com, meaning together, and pati, meaning to suffer. So compassion means to suffer together. There are times when our only response to another's pain is to actually share it. Sorrow shared is sorrow halved, as an old German saying puts it. So UUs seek to create caring communities in their congregations, a mutual ministry grappling with life's challenges. We realize that none of us can navigate life's treacherous waters alone. The striking thing about compassion is that this feeling of deep sympathy and sorrow for another who is stricken by suffering is accompanied by a strong desire to alleviate the pain or remove its cause. Sympathy, feeling pity, turns into empathy, feeling with someone, and finally compels action to serve the needs of the neighbor. A great example of suffering together, compassion, resulting in action is found in the story of Margaret Sanger. She was the founder of the Planned Parenthood movement. She was a public health nurse who day after day visited scenes of suffering in which poor women were plunged into even greater despair with unwanted pregnancies. She said, "These were not merely unfortunate conditions among the poor, such as we read about. I knew the women personally," she said. "They were living, breathing human beings with hopes, fears, aspirations like my own." Sanger told the story of Mrs. Sachs, a 28-year-old woman with septicemia resulting from a self-induced abortion. The woman's doctor warned her that one more pregnancy could be fatal. She begged the doctor to tell her what she could do to avoid the pregnancy. The doctor said, "Tell your husband Jake to sleep on the roof." Mrs. Sachs begged Margaret Sanger, "Please tell me the secret to not getting pregnant, and I'll never breathe it to a soul." Sanger was haunted by the request, but did nothing. 3 months later, Mrs. Sachs was pregnant again, went into a coma, and died. Margaret Sanger left the deathbed scene and walked the streets. That night, she decided that she could not go on like this, merely as a witness to human suffering. She said, "I was resolved to seek out the root of evil, to do something to change the destiny of mothers whose miseries were vast as the sky." The Planned Parenthood movement is the social action that grew out of her compassion for one suffering human being. David Reese Williams, a UU minister, articulated this sense of compassion when he wrote, "We are joined together by a mystic oneness whose source we may never know, but whose reality we can never doubt. We are our neighbor's keeper, because that neighbor is but our larger self. Behold, thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself, because thy neighbor is thyself." So that's the reading from Richard Gilbert. So when we talk about justice, equity, and compassion as the second principle of Unitarian Universalism, and we've learned from the reading that compassion means to suffer with or to suffer together, it kind of gives a new interpretation of what many of us have thought of as compassion. We realize that compassion is not this bleeding heart, mushy-gushy, wimpy thing that it's often made out to be. Compassion takes courage. It means you're willing to walk with and be with and hold another person's pain that's not yours, pain that is theirs. And you're willing to do this even for a little while and do it completely voluntarily. I mean, I think that is a very, very courageous act, isn't it? But the upside of all of this, of actually feeling someone's pain, is that's what it takes to be compelled to do something about it. But yet most of us really spend our life sheltered from the pain of others. And you know, this is kind of intentional. I mean, you can see why you'd want to shelter yourself from pain, right? I think that's a very natural response. Because, you know, life is hard enough. Why should we take on the suffering of others if we're lucky to be free of suffering ourselves? You know, and we still, ultimately, whether we're in deep suffering or not, have our own problems, our own stuff in life that we have to deal with. Now, I'm going to make a confession. I'm going to see if anyone will confess along with me. Does anyone else here change the channel when the Save the Children or Save the Animals commercials come on? No, you're not. I'll tell you no. So why do we do that? I don't think it's because we're insensitive and uncaring people. I think sometimes we're just not ready to be pulled into that suffering that is being made very real for us on those commercials. You know, it's hard. We don't want to be pulled into this abyss of helplessness and hopelessness. You know, who just welcomes, oh, bad feelings, come on in, join the party. But yet, there is a cost to this avoidance. Doesn't mean we're horrible people, but there is a cost. And the cost is that when we avoid this suffering, we become mentally detached from it, and it makes us less able to want to respond to it. And we don't only just become detached from those who are suffering, we become detached really from our own humanity. Because if we don't suffer together or have that compassionate impulse towards others, you know, we're likely not to do anything about anyone's suffering. But yet, even at our best moments of compassion, it's a fine balance because we have to still kind of take care of ourselves while we absorb the pain of others. It's a really fine balance because it is easy to still fall into that abyss. And knowing how to feel compassion and feel the suffering of others, but still preserve and protect your own emotional well-being is a very, very delicate dance we have to do as human beings. This reminds me of a time when I did some suffering with that was pretty intense, that really did compel me to act in a way I probably would have never done otherwise. Before I became a minister, just as a church member, I signed up for an intensive workshop. It was called, offered by the UUA, it was called Jubilee Anti-Racism Training, Learning Together About Systemic Racism. And it was a full weekend, it was 2.5 days, and it was a workshop. It was taught by two trainers who came in from other cities, a black man, a white woman, who taught the workshop together. The workshop goals were to deepen our understanding of how race and ethnicity play out in our institutions and in our daily lives. And for me, this workshop was really transformational because, you know, I had always considered myself kind of woke and anti-racist. And this workshop taught me how very, very little I really knew. We spent many hours listening to heartbreaking stories, many told by individuals from their personal experience. And we had to sit with it, and we had to suffer with those terrible stories, those terrible moments of inhumanity and inequality in our country's history and our present. We sat with it. We suffered it together. And that is what, for me, honestly, made it real. Very, very real, more real than it had been before, because I felt it at a very, very deep level. Now, some people in the training, some white people in the training got defensive. They felt like they had been manipulated into feeling bad about white people. They were like, why should we be made to feel guilty about bad things that we had no part in doing, and for having white privilege we never asked for, they said. But, you know, I didn't feel that way. I was ready to go there. I went there and I accepted the pain. I allowed myself to feel it. I figured it was the least I could do because my pain was minimal in comparison to the suffering of others over the last 400 years and continuing well on through this day. And again, maybe without that pain, if I didn't feel that pain, it probably would not have hit home with me and been such a transformational experience. I finally realized, like, I felt like I'd been lied to all my life, that everything I had been taught about fairness and how society works, like the rules were for the same for everybody, totally not true. You know, I felt like I'd really been lied to. But, you know, through this process, my blinders were peeled off, and I learned about racism in our institutions, how it's built in, even when no one is even actively trying to do racist stuff. It's just kind of baked in the cake. And I was changed. But in that process, I was so emotionally worn. For days after the workshop, I walked around like I had just had the wind knocked out of me. It was actually almost like really disorienting. But it was worth it because I learned what I needed to. Not to say that learning isn't an ongoing, lifelong process, but it made me a better person, a more compassionate person, more willing to speak up for justice. And I did take action in a number of ways, feeling compelled to speak up, especially in my workplace at the time. Now, I didn't move mountains or do anything, you know, I didn't fix any huge world issue or anything, but I do think my voice made a difference. And by speaking up, I could at least say my conscience was clear. It really was this compassion that had been cultivated through suffering that made me do what I did. So I think that compassion, you know, it's really the catalyst that spurs us into action, that compels us to do work for equity and justice. I think I call it like the secret formula of this, the second principle. I'm not a chemist, so I can't make equations, but I'd say it would be something like knowledge plus compassion equals equals equity and justice, or actions for equity and justice. I told you I would be a really bad chemist or mathematician. Personally, though, I still continue to struggle with the second principle because although I agree with it wholeheartedly, I feel bad that I can't do more, you know, that I can't be more compassionate, that I can't be more active in justice work. I mean, there is so much pain in the world, and it's not decreasing anytime soon. If anything, it seems like it's increasing. And that's overwhelming. It really is. I wish I could go to more meetings. I wish I could join more causes. I wish I could do more public witness. And I live with a degree of guilt that I'm not doing enough. But again, at the same time, I'm learning my limitations on my time and my energy, because a physically and emotionally exhausted me just running around freaking out all over the place is really not much help to anyone. So that's something I think we all have to keep in mind when we're out there trying to save the world. It really is a delicate balance of the self and service that we have to figure out ourselves. Yet, giving to and advocating for others really does have its own inherent rewards as well. There can be joy in this work. The work can give energy, it can give meaning and purpose, it can build relationships, right? As long as we avoid that point, getting to that point where we all risk getting pulled into the abyss. But then again, if you never try, you never put yourself out there and actually do the work, you will really never know your limitations. So I think it's okay to do some testing and then pay close attention to what you find out. Because, you know, the way we live our lives, a lot of us who have a certain amount of financial privilege, you know, it's so easy for us to fall into this self-serving, self-centered life. It's kind of a life we're trained, we're conditioned to have these lives, these consumer lives with all the good things, with all the quality of life, with all the stuff we see on commercials. So our society often encourages this self-centeredness, so we consume. But there is a way to live a more selfless life. People who are raising children, I give them a lot of credit, because that is like high-level selflessness right there. They have an excuse. But I'm talking more about these an unselfishness avoiding that's kind of it's all about me attitude and that kind of life. And although this kind of life they tell you about in the commercials may seem really attractive, it's ultimately really unfulfilling for anyone who craves wholeness and something deeper, right? The superficial things are not really what make us happy. The self-centered life, it can't really fill us up with meaning and purpose and transformational connections and relationships. Another thing I'd like to note is that our second UU principle is really an outgrowth of our first principle. Our first principle is that we affirm the inherent worth and dignity of every person. So the second one kind of flows out of this because it's the first principle that makes it possible. So because if we believe in the worth and dignity of human beings, we must believe that they are worthy of compassion as well. And when we feel the compassion, we have to believe that we are, compelled to act for equity and for justice. Because humans with inherent worth and dignity deserve, if you have worth and dignity, you deserve to be treated fairly. You deserve to be treated justly. But in our world and in our neighborhoods, everywhere, fair treatment is not the reality for many. Injustice and inequality is everywhere, and in most cases, there's strong evidence that the disparity between the haves and the have-nots is only growing to levels never experienced before. So I'm going to ask you today, how much compassion are you willing to let yourself feel? How much of that round rug are you willing to give to someone else? How much compassion are you going to feel that it will be enough so that you take action? Enough to do something you wouldn't have otherwise even thought of doing. Enough compassion to put yourself aside for a while to focus on someone else. That's what our religion, with all its principles, all its ethics, and all its noble words, is asking us to do. If we do not act on them, they're just noble words and nothing more. Justice, equity, compassion. What do those words mean in your life? And what are you going to do to put those words into action? Amen.